Section 1 of Chapter 18 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Richard Carpenter. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 18, Section 1. On the 19th of October, 1691, William arrived at Kensington from the Netherlands. 3 days later he opened the Parliament. The aspect of affairs was, on the whole, cheering. By land there had been gains and losses, but the balance was in favour of England. Against the fall of Mons might well be offset the taking of Athlone, the victory of Agram, the surrender of Limerick, and the pacification of Ireland. At sea there had been no great victory, but there had been a great display of power and of activity, and though many were dissatisfied because more had not been done, none could deny that there had been a change for the better. The ruin caused by the foibles and vices of Torrington had been repaired. The fleet had been well equipped. The rations had been abundant and wholesome, and the health of the crews had consequently been for that age wonderfully good. Russell, who commanded the naval forces of the Allies, had in vain offered battle to the French. The white flag, which in the preceding year had ranged the Channel unresisted from Land's End to the Straits of Dover, now, as soon as our topmasts were descried 20 leagues off, abandoned the open seas and retired into the depths of the harbour of Brest. The appearance of an English squadron in the estuary of the Shannon had decided the fate of the last fortress which had held out for King James, and a fleet of merchantmen from the Levant, valued at 4 millions sterling, had, through dangers which had caused many sleepless nights to the underwriters of Lombard Street, been convoyed safe into the Thames. The Lords and Commons listened with signs of satisfaction to a speech in which the King congratulated them on the event of the war in Ireland, and expressed his confidence that they would continue to support him in the war with France. He told them that a great naval armament would be necessary, and that, in his opinion, the conflict by land could not be effectually maintained with less than 65,000 men. He was thanked in affectionate terms. The force which he asked was voted, and large supplies were granted with little difficulty. But when the ways and means were taken into consideration, symptoms of discontent began to appear. 18 months before, when the Commons had been employed in settling the civil list, many members had shown a very natural disposition to complain of the amount of salaries and fees received by official men. Keen speeches had been made, and what was much less usual had been printed. There had been much excitement out of doors, but nothing had been done. The subject was now revived. A report made by the commissioners who had been appointed in the preceding year to examine the public's accounts disclosed some facts which excited indignation and others which raised grave suspicion. The House seemed fully determined to make an extensive reform, and in truth nothing could have averted such a reform except the folly and the violence of the reformers. That they should have been angry is indeed not strange. The enormous gains, direct and indirect, of the servants of the public went on increasing, while the gains of everybody else were diminishing. Rents were falling, trade was languishing. Every man who lived either on what his ancestors had left him or on the fruits of his own industry was forced to retrench. The placeman alone throve amidst the general distress. "Look," cried the incensed squires, "at the comptroller of the customs. 10 years ago he walked and we rode. Our incomes have been curtailed. His salary has been doubled. We have sold our horses, and he has bought them. And now we go on foot, and are splashed by his coach and six." Lothair vainly endeavoured to stand up against the storm. He was heard with little favour by the country gentlemen, who had not long before looked upon him as one of their leaders. He had left them. He had become a courtier. He had 2 good places, one in the treasury and the other in the household. He had recently received from the king's own hand a gratuity of 2,000 guineas. It seemed perfectly natural that he should defend abuses by which he profited. The taunts and reproaches with which he was assailed were insupportable to his sensitive nature. He lost his head, almost fainted away on the floor of the house, and talked about righting himself in another place. Unfortunately, no member rose at this conjuncture to propose that the civil establishment of the kingdom should be carefully revised, that sinecures should be abolished, that exorbitant official income should be reduced, and that no servant of the state should be allowed to exact, under any pretense, anything beyond his known and lawful remuneration. In this way it would have been possible to diminish the public burdens, and at the same time to increase the efficiency of every public department. But unfortunately, those who were loudest in clamoring against the prevailing abuses were utterly destitute of the qualities necessary for the work of reform. On the 12th of December, some foolish man, whose name has not come down to us, moved that no person employed in any civil office, the Speaker, judges, and ambassadors excepted, should receive more than £500 a year, and this motion was not only carried, but carried without one dissentient voice. Those who were most interested in opposing it doubtless saw that opposition would, at the moment, only irritate the majority, and reserved themselves for a more favourable time. The more favourable time soon came. No man of common sense could, when his blood had cooled, remember without shame that he had voted for a resolution which made no distinction between sinecurists and laborious public servants, between clerks employed in copying letters and ministers on whose wisdom and integrity the fate of the nation might depend. The salary of the doorkeeper of the excise office had been, by a scandalous job, raised to 500 a year. It ought to have been reduced to 50. On the other hand, the services of a Secretary of State, who was well qualified for his post, would have been cheap at 5,000. If the resolution of the Commons had been carried into effect, both the salary which ought not to have exceeded £50, and the salary which might, without impropriety, have amounted to 5,000, would have been fixed at 500. Such absurdity must have shocked even the roughest and plainest fox hunter in the House. A reaction took place, and when, after an interval of a few weeks, it was proposed to insert in a bill of supply a clause in conformity with the resolution of the 12th of December, the noes were loud, the Speaker was of the opinion that they had had it, the ayes did not venture to dispute his opinion. The senseless plan, which had been approved without a division, was rejected without a division. The subject was not again mentioned. Thus a grievance so scandalous that none of those who profited by it dared to defend it was perpetuated merely by the imbecility and intemperance of those who attacked it. Early in the session, the Treaty of Limerick became the subject of a grave and earnest discussion. The Commons, in the exercise of that supreme power which the English legislature possessed over all the dependencies of England, sent up to the Lords a bill providing that no person should sit in the Irish Parliament, should hold an Irish office, civil, military, or ecclesiastical, or should practice law or medicine in Ireland, till he had taken the oaths of allegiance and supremacy, and had subscribed the declaration against transubstantiation. The Lords were not more inclined than the Commons to favour the Irish. No peer was disposed to entrust Roman Catholics with political power. Nay, it seems that no peer objected to the principle of the absurd and cruel rule which excluded Roman Catholics from the liberal professions. But it was thought that this rule, though unobjectionable in principle, would, if adopted without some exceptions, be a breach of a positive compact. Their lordships called for the Treaty of Limerick, ordered it to be read at the table, and proceeded to consider whether the law framed by the lower house was consistent with the engagements into which the government had entered. One discrepancy was noticed. It was stipulated by the second civil article that every person actually residing in any fortress occupied by an Irish garrison should be permitted, on taking the oath of allegiance, to resume any calling which he had exercised before the Revolution. It would, beyond all doubt, have been a violation of this covenant to require that a lawyer or a physician, who had been within the walls of Limerick during the siege, should take the oath of supremacy and subscribe the declaration against transubstantiation before he could receive fees. Holt was consulted and was directed to prepare clauses in conformity with the terms of the capitulation. The bill, as amended by Holt, was sent back to the Commons. They at first rejected the amendment and demanded a conference. The conference was granted. Rochester, in the Painted Chamber, delivered to the managers of the lower house a copy of the Treaty of Limerick, and earnestly represented the importance of preserving the public faith inviolate. This appeal was one which no honest man, though inflamed by national and religious animosity, could resist. The Commons reconsidered the subject, and, after hearing the treaty read, agreed, with some slight modifications, to what the Lords had proposed. The bill became a law. It attracted at the time little notice, but was, after the lapse of several generations, the subject of a very acrimonious controversy. Many of us can well remember how strongly the public mind was stirred, in the days of George III and George IV, by the question whether Roman Catholics should be permitted to sit in Parliament. It may be doubted whether any dispute has produced stranger perversions of history. The whole past was falsified for the sake of the present. All the great events of 3 centuries long appeared to us distorted and discolored by a mist sprung from our own theories and our own passions. Some friends of religious liberty, not content with the advantage which they possessed in the fair conflict of reason with reason, weakened their case by maintaining that the law which excluded Irish Roman Catholics from Parliament was inconsistent with the civil treaty of Limerick. The first article of that treaty, it was said, guaranteed to the Irish Roman Catholic such privileges in the exercise of his religion as he had enjoyed at the time of Charles II. In the time of Charles II, no test excluded Roman Catholics from the Irish Parliament. Such a test could not, therefore, it was argued, be imposed without a breach of public faith. In the year 1828, especially, this argument was put forward in the House of Commons as if it had been the main strength of a cause which stood in need of no such support. The champions of Protestant ascendancy were well pleased to see the debate diverted from a political question about which they were in the wrong to a historical question about which they were in the right. They had no difficulty in proving that the first article, as understood by all contracting parties, meant only that the Roman Catholic worship should be tolerated as in times past. That article was drawn up by Ginkell, and just before he drew it up, he had declared that he would rather try the chances of arms than consent that Irish papists should be capable of holding civil and military offices, of exercising liberal professions, and of becoming members of municipal corporations. How is it possible to believe that he would, of his own accord, have promised that the House of Lords and the House of Commons should be open to men to whom he would not open a guild of skinners or a guild of cordwainers? How, again, is it possible to believe that the English peers would, while professing the most punctilious respect for public faith, while lecturing the Commons on the duty of observing public faith, while taking counsel with the most learned and upright jurist of the age as to the best mode of maintaining public faith, have committed a flagrant violation of public faith, and that not a single lord would have been so honest or so factitious as to protest against an act of monstrous perfidy aggravated by hypocrisy? Or, if we could believe this, how can we believe that no voice would have been raised in any part of the world against such wickedness, that the court of Saint-Germain and the court of Versailles would have remained profoundly silent, that no Irish exile, no English malcontent would have uttered a murmur, that not a word of invective or sarcasm on so inviting a subject would have been found in the whole compass of the Jacobite literature, and that it would have been reserved for politicians of the 19th century to discover that a treaty made in the 17th century had, a few weeks after it had been signed, been outrageously violated in the sight of all Europe. On the same day on which the Commons read for the first time the bill which subjected Ireland to the absolute dominion of the Protestant minority, they took into consideration another matter of high importance. Throughout the country, but especially in the capital, in the seaports and in the manufacturing towns, the minds of men were greatly excited on the subject of trade with the East Indies. A fierce paper war had during some time been raging, and several grave questions, both constitutional and commercial, had been raised, which the legislature only could decide. It had often been repeated, and ought never to be forgotten, that our polity differs widely from those politics which have, during the last 80 years, been methodically constructed, digested into articles, and ratified by constituent assemblies. It grew up in a rude age. It is not to be found entire in any formal instrument. All along the line which separates the functions of the prince from those of the legislator, there was long a disputed territory. Encroachments were perpetually committed, and, if not very outrageous, were often tolerated. Trespass, merely as trespass, was commonly suffered to pass unresented. It was only when the trespass produced some positive damage that the aggrieved party stood on his right, and demanded that the frontier should be set out by metes and bounds, and that the landmark should thenceforth be punctiliously respected. Many of those points which had occasioned the most violent disputes between our sovereigns and their parliaments had been finally decided by the Bill of Rights. But one question, scarcely less important than any of the questions which had been set at rest forever, was still undetermined. Indeed, that question was never, as far as can now be ascertained, even mentioned in the Convention. The king had undoubtedly, by the ancient laws of the realm, large powers for the regulation of trade, but the ablest judge would have found it difficult to say what was the precise extent of those powers. It was universally acknowledged that it belonged to the king to prescribe weights and measures, and to coin money, that no fair or market could be held without authority from him, that no ship could unload in any bay or estuary which he had not declared to be a port. In addition to his undoubted right to grant special commercial privileges to particular places, he long claimed a right to grant special commercial privileges to particular societies and to particular individuals. And our ancestors, as usual, did not think it worth their while to dispute this claim till it produced serious inconvenience. At length, in the reign of Elizabeth, the power of creating monopolies began to be grossly abused, and as soon as it began to be grossly abused, it began to be questioned. The Queen wisely declined a conflict with a House of Commons backed by the whole nation. She frankly acknowledged that there was reason for complaint. She cancelled the patents which had excited the public clamours, and her people, delighted by this concession and by the gracious manner in which it had been made, did not require from her an express renunciation of the disputed prerogative. The discontents which her wisdom had appeased were revived by the dishonest and pusillanimous policy which her successor called kingcraft. He readily granted oppressive patents of monopoly. When he needed the help of his parliament, he readily annulled them. As soon as the parliaments had ceased to sit, his great seal was put to instruments more odious than those which he had recently cancelled. At length that excellent House of Commons, which met in 1623, determined to apply a strong remedy to the evil. The king was forced to assent to a law which declared monopolies established by royal authority to be null and void. Some exceptions, however, were made, and unfortunately were not very clearly defined. It was especially provided that every society of merchants, which had been instituted for the purpose of carrying on any trade, should retain all of its legal privileges. The question whether a monopoly granted by the crown to such a company were or were not a legal privilege was left unsettled, and continued to exercise during many years the ingenuity of lawyers. The nation, however, relieved at once from a multitude of impositions and vexations, which were painfully felt every day at every fireside, was in no humour to dispute the validity of the charters under which a few companies to London traded with distant parts of the world. Of these companies, by far the most important was that which had been, on the last day of the 16th century, incorporated by Queen Elizabeth under the name of the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading to the East Indies. When this celebrated body began to exist, the Mogul monarchy was at the zenith of its power and glory. Akbar, the ablest and best of the princes of the house of Tamerlane, had just been born, full of years and honours, to a mausoleum surpassing in magnificence any that Europe could show. He had bequeathed to his posterity an empire containing more than 20 times the population, and yielding more than 20 times the revenue of the England which, under our great Queen, held a foremost place among European powers. It is curious and interesting to consider how little the two countries, destined to be one day so closely connected, were then known to each other. The most enlightened Englishmen looked on India with ignorant admiration. The most enlightened natives of India were scarcely aware that England existed. Our ancestors had a dim notion of endless bazaars, swarming with buyers and sellers, and blazing with cloth of gold, with variegated silks and with precious stones, of treasuries where diamonds were piled in heaps and sequins in mountains, of palaces compared with which Whitehall and Hampton Court were hovels, of armies 10 times as numerous as that which they had seen assembled at Tilbury to repel the Armada. On the other hand, it was probably not known to one of the statesmen of the Durbar of Agra that there was near the setting sun a great city of infidels called London, where a woman reigned, and that she had given to an association of Frank merchants the exclusive privilege of freighting ships from her dominions to the Indian seas. That this association would one day rule all India, from the ocean to the everlasting snow, would reduce to profound obedience great provinces which had never submitted to Akbar's authority, would send lieutenant governors to preside in his capital, and would dole out a monthly pension to his heir, would have seemed to the wisest of European or of Oriental politicians as impossible as the inhabitants of our globe should find an empire in Venus or Jupiter. End of section 1. Recording by Richard Carpenter in Seattle, Washington.
Section 2 of Chapter 18 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jen Raimundo. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 18, Section 2. 3 generations passed away, and still nothing indicated that the East India Company would ever become a great Asiatic potentate. The Mogul Empire, though undermined by internal causes of decay and tottering to its fall, still presented to distant nations the appearance of undiminished prosperity and vigour. Aurungzebe, who, in the same month in which Oliver Cromwell died, assumed the magnificent title of Conqueror of the World, continued to reign till Anne had been long on the English throne. He was the sovereign of a larger territory than had obeyed any of his predecessors. His name was great in the farthest regions of the West. Here he had been made by Dryden the hero of a tragedy which would alone suffice to show how little the English of that age knew about the vast empire which their grandchildren were to conquer and to govern. The poet's Mussulman princes make love in the style of Amadis, preach about the death of Socrates, and embellish their discourse with allusions to the mythological stories of Ovid. Their Brahminical metempsychosis is represented as an article of the Mussulman creed, and the Mussulman sultanas burn themselves with their husbands after the Brahminical fashion. This drama, once rapturously applauded by crowded theatres, and known by heart to fine gentlemen and fine ladies, is now forgotten. But one noble passage still lives, and is repeated by thousands who know not whence it comes. Though nothing yet indicated the high political destiny of the East India Company, that body had a great sway in the city of London. The offices, which stood on a very small part of the ground which the present offices cover, had escaped the ravages of the fire. The India House of those days was a building of timber and plaster, rich with the quaint carving and lattice work of the Elizabethan age. Above the windows was a painting which represented a fleet of merchantmen tossing on the waves. The whole edifice was surmounted by a colossal wooden seaman, who, from between 2 dolphins, looked down on the crowds of Leadenhall Street. In this abode, narrow and humble indeed when compared with the vast labyrinth of passages and chambers which now bears the same name, the company enjoyed, during the greater part of the reign of Charles II, a prosperity to which the history of trade scarcely furnishes any parallel, and which excited the wonder, the cupidity, and the envious animosity of the whole capital. Wealth and luxury were then rapidly increasing. The taste for the spices, the tissues, and the jewels of the East became stronger day by day. Tea, which at the time when Monk brought the army of Scotland to London had been handed round to be stared at and just touched with the lips, as a great rarity from China, was, 8 years later, a regular article of import, and was soon consumed in such quantities that financiers began to consider it as a subject for taxation. The progress which was making in the art of war had created an unprecedented demand for the ingredients of which gunpowder is compounded. It was calculated that all Europe would hardly produce in a year saltpetre enough for the siege of one town fortified on the principles of Vauban. But for the supplies from India, it was said, the English government would be unable to equip a fleet without digging up the cellars of London in order to collect the nitrous particles from the walls. Before the Restoration scarcely one ship from the Thames had ever visited the delta of the Ganges. But during the 23 years which followed the Restoration, the value of the annual imports from that rich and populous district increased from £8,000 to £300,000. The gains of the body which had the exclusive possession of this fast-growing trade were almost incredible. The capital which had been actually paid up did not exceed £370,000. But the company could, without difficulty, borrow money at 6 per cent., and the borrowed money, thrown into the trade, produced, it was rumoured, 30 per cent. The profits were such that, in 1676, every proprietor received as a bonus a quantity of stock equal to that which he held. On the capital, thus doubled, were paid during 5 years dividends amounting on an average to 20 per cent. Annually. There had been a time when £100 of the stock could be purchased for 60. Even in 1664 the price in the market was only 70. But in 1677 the price had risen to 245. In 1681 it was 300. It subsequently rose to 360, and it is said that some sales were effected at 500. The enormous giants of the Indian trade might perhaps have excited little murmuring if they had been distributed among numerous proprietors. But while the value of the stock went on increasing, the number of stockholders went on diminishing. At the time when the prosperity of the company reached the highest point, the management was entirely in the hands of a few merchants of enormous wealth. A proprietor then had a vote for every £500 of stock that stood in his name. It is asserted in the pamphlets of that age that 5 persons had a 1/6 part, and 14 persons a 1/3 part of the votes. More than one fortunate speculator was said to derive an annual income of £10,000 from the monopoly, and one great man was pointed out on the Royal Exchange as having, by judicious or lucky purchases of stock, created in no long time an estate of £20,000 a year. This commercial grandee, who in wealth and in the influence which attends wealth vied with the greatest nobles of his time, was Sir Josiah Child. There were those who still remembered him an apprentice, sweeping one of the counting-houses of the city. But from a humble position his abilities had raised him rapidly to opulence, power, and fame. At the time of the Restoration he was highly considered in the mercantile world. Soon after that event he published his thoughts on the philosophy of trade. His speculations were not always sound, but they were the speculations of an ingenious and reflecting man. Into whatever errors he may occasionally have fallen as a theorist, it is certain that, as a practical man of business, he had few equals. Almost as soon as he became a member of the committee which directed the affairs of the company, his ascendancy was felt. Soon many of the most important posts, both in Leadenhall Street and in the factories of Bombay and Bengal, were filled by his kinsmen and creatures. His riches, though expended with ostentatious profusion, continued to increase and multiply. He obtained a baronetcy, he purchased a stately seat at Wanstead, and there he laid out immense sums in excavating fish-ponds and in planting whole square miles of barren land with walnut trees. He married his daughter to the eldest son of the Duke of Beaufort, and paid down with her a portion of £50,000. But this wonderful prosperity was not uninterrupted. Towards the close of the reign of Charles II, the company began to be fiercely attacked from without, and to be at the same time distracted by internal dissensions. The profits of the Indian trade were so tempting that private adventurers had often, in defiance of the royal charter, fitted out ships for the eastern seas. But the competition of these interlopers did not become really formidable till the year 1680. The nation was then violently agitated by the dispute about the Exclusion Bill. Timid men were anticipating another civil war. The two great parties, newly named Whigs and Tories, were fiercely contending in every county and town of England, and the feud soon spread to every corner of the civilized world where Englishmen were to be found. The company was popularly considered as a Whig body. Among the members of the directing committee were some of the most vehement exclusionists in the city. Indeed, two of them, Sir Samuel Barnardiston and Thomas Papillon, drew on themselves a severe persecution by their zeal against popery and arbitrary power. Child had been originally brought into the direction by these men. He had long acted in concert with them, and he was supposed to hold their political opinions. He had, during many years, stood high in the esteem of the chiefs of the parliamentary opposition, and had been especially obnoxious to the Duke of York. The interlopers therefore determined to affect the character of loyal men, who were determined to stand by the throne against the insolent tribunes of the city. They spread, at all the factories in the east, reports that England was in confusion, that the sword had been drawn or would immediately be drawn, and that the Company was forward in the rebellion against the Crown. These rumours, which in truth were not improbable, easily found credit among people separated from London by what was then a voyage of 12 months. Some servants of the Company who were in ill humour with their employers, and others who were zealous royalists, joined the private traders. At Bombay, the garrison and the great body of the English inhabitants declared that they would no longer obey anybody who did not obey the king. They imprisoned the deputy governor, and they proclaimed that they held the island for the crown. At St. Helena there was a rising. The insurgents took the name of King's men, and displayed the royal standard. They were, not without difficulty, put down, and some of them were executed by martial law. If the Company had still been a Whig company when the news of these commotions reached England, it is probable that the government would have approved of the conduct of the mutineers, and that the charter on which the monopoly depended would have had the fate which about the same time befell so many other charters. But while the interlopers were, at a distance of many thousands of miles, making war on the Company in the name of the King, the Company and the King had been reconciled. When the Oxford Parliament had been dissolved, when many signs indicated that a strong reaction in favour of prerogative was at hand, when all the corporations which had incurred the royal displeasure were beginning to tremble for their franchises, a rapid and complete revolution took place at the India House. Child, who was then governor, or in the modern phrase, chairman, separated himself from his old friends, excluded them from the direction, and negotiated a treaty of peace and of close alliance with the court. It is not improbable that the near connection into which he had just entered with the great Tory house of Beaufort may have had something to do with his change in his politics. Papillon, Barnardiston, and their adherents sold their stock, their places in the committee were supplied by persons devoted to Child, and he was thenceforth the autocrat of the Company. The treasures of the Company were absolutely at his disposal. The most important papers of the Company were kept, not in the muniment room of the office in Leadenhall Street, but in his desk at Wanstead. The boundless power which he exercised at the India House enabled him to become a favourite at Whitehall, and the favour which he enjoyed at Whitehall confirmed his power at the India House. A present of 10,000 guineas was graciously received from him by Charles. 10,000 more were accepted by James, who readily consented to become a holder of stock. All who could help or hurt at court, ministers, mistresses, priests, were kept in good humour by presents of shawls and silks, birds' nests and attar of roses, bulses of diamonds and bags of guineas. Of what the dictator expended no account was asked by his colleagues, and in truth he seems to have deserved the confidence which they reposed in him. His bribes, distributed with judicious prodigality, speedily produced a large return. Just when the court became all-powerful in the state, he became all-powerful at the court. Jeffreys pronounced a decision in favour of the monopoly, and of the strongest acts which had been done in defence of the monopoly. James ordered his seal to be put to a new charter which confirmed and extended all the privileges bestowed on the Company by his predecessors. All captains of Indiamen received commissions from the Crown, and were permitted to hoist the royal ensigns. John Child, brother of Sir Josiah, and governor of Bombay, was created a baronet by the style of Sir John Child of Surat. He was declared general of all the English forces in the East, and he was authorised to assume the title of Excellency. The Company, on the other hand, distinguished itself among many servile corporations by obsequious homage to the throne, and set to all the merchants of the kingdom the example of readily and even eagerly paying those customs which James, at the commencement of his reign, exacted without the authority of Parliament. It seemed that the private trade would now be utterly crushed, and that the monopoly, protected by the whole strength of the royal prerogative, would be more profitable than ever. But unfortunately just at this moment a quarrel arose between the agents of the Company in India and the Mogul government. Where the fault lay is a question which was vehemently disputed at the time, and which it is now impossible to decide. The interlopers threw all the blame on the Company. The governor of Bombay, they affirmed, had always been grasping and violent, but his baronetcy and his military commission had completely turned his head. The very natives who were employed about the factory had noticed the change, and had muttered, in their broken English, that there must be some strange curse attending the word Excellency, for that, ever since the chief of the strangers was called Excellency, everything had gone to ruin. Meanwhile, it was said, the brother in England had sanctioned all the unjust and impolitic acts of the brother in India, till at length insolence and rapine, disgraceful to the English nation and to the Christian religion, had roused the just resentment of the native authorities. The company warmly recriminated. The story told at the India House was that the quarrel was entirely the work of the interlopers, who were now designated not only as interlopers but as traitors. They had, it was alleged, by flattery, by presents, and by false accusations, induced the viceroys of the Mogul to oppress and persecute the body which in Asia represented the English crown. And indeed this charge seems not to have been altogether without foundation. It is certain that one of the most pertinacious enemies of the child's went up to the court of Aurangzebe, took his station at the palace gate, stopped the great king who was in the act of mounting on horseback, and, lifting a petition high in the air, demanded justice in the name of the common God of Christians and Mussulmans. Whether Aurangzebe paid much attention to the charges brought by infidel Franks against each other may be doubted, but it is certain that a complete rupture took place between his deputies and the servants of the company. On the sea the ships of his subjects were seized by the English. On land the English settlements were taken and plundered. The trade was suspended, and, though great annual dividends were still paid in London, they were no longer paid out of annual profits. Just at this conjuncture, while every Indiaman that arrived in the Thames was bringing unwelcome news from the East, all the politics of Sir Josiah were utterly confounded by the Revolution. He had flattered himself that he had secured the body of which he was the chief against the machinations of interlopers, by uniting it closely with the strongest government that had existed within his memory. That government had fallen, and whatever had leaned on the ruined fabric began to totter. The bribes had been thrown away. The connections which had been the strength and boast of the corporation were now its weakness and its shame. The king who had been one of its members was in exile. The judge by whom all its most exorbitant pretensions had been pronounced legitimate was a prisoner. All the old enemies of the company, reinforced by those great Whig merchants whom Child had expelled from the direction, demanded justice and vengeance from the Whig House of Commons, which had just placed William and Mary on the throne. No voice was louder in accusation than that of Papillon, who had, some years before, been more zealous for the charter than any man in London. The Commons censured in severe terms the persons who had inflicted death by martial law at St. Helena, and even resolved that some of those offenders should be excluded from the Act of Indemnity. The great question, how the trade with the East should for the future be carried on, was referred to a committee. The report was to have been made on the 27th of January 1690, but on that very day the Parliament ceased to exist. The first two sessions of the succeeding Parliament were so short and so busy that little was said about India in either House. But out of Parliament all the arts both of controversy and of intrigue were employed on both sides. Almost as many pamphlets were published about the India trade as about the oaths. The despot of Leadenhall Street was libelled in prose and verse. Wretched puns were made on his name. He was compared to Cromwell, to the King of France, to Goliath of Gath, to the devil. It was vehemently declared to be necessary that, in any act which might be passed for the regulation of our traffic with the Eastern seas, Sir Josiah should be by name excluded from all trust. End of section 2. Recording by Jen Raimundo. Section 3 of Chapter 18 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jen Raimundo. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 18. Section 3. There were, however, great differences of opinion among those who agreed in hating Child and the body of which he was the head. The manufacturers of Spitalfields, of Norwich, of Yorkshire, and of the western counties considered the trade with the eastern seas as rather injurious than beneficial to the kingdom. The importation of Indian spices, indeed, was admitted to be harmless, and the importation of Indian saltpetre to be necessary. But the importation of silks and of Bengals, as shawls were then called, was pronounced to be a curse to the country. The effect of the growing taste for such frippery was that our gold and silver went abroad, and that much excellent English drapery lay in our warehouses till it was devoured by the moths. Those, it was said, were happy days for the inhabitants both of our pasture lands and of our manufacturing towns, when every gown, every hanging, every bed was made of materials which our own flocks had furnished to our own looms. Where were now the brave old hangings of arras which had adorned the walls of lordly mansions in the days of Elizabeth? And was it not a shame to see a gentleman, whose ancestors had worn nothing but stuffs made by English workmen out of English fleeces, flaunting in a calico shirt and a pair of silk stockings? Clamours such as these had, a few years before, extorted from Parliament the Act which required that the dead should be wrapped in woollen; and some sanguine clothiers hoped that the legislature would, by excluding all Indian textures from our ports, impose the same necessity on the living. But this feeling was confined to a minority. The public was indeed inclined to overrate than to underrate the benefits which might be derived by England from the Indian trade. What was the most effectual mode of extending that trade was a question which excited general interest, and which was answered in very different ways. A small party, consisting chiefly of merchants resident at Bristol and other provincial seaports, maintained that the best way to extend trade was to leave it free. They urged the well-known arguments which prove that monopoly is injurious to commerce, and, having fully established the general law, they asked why the commerce between England and India was to be considered as an exception to that law. Any trader ought, they said, to be permitted to send from any port a cargo to Surat or Canton as freely as he now sent a cargo to Hamburg or Lisbon. In our times these doctrines may probably be considered not only as sound, but as trite and obvious. In the 17th century, however, they were thought paradoxical. It was then generally held to be a certain, and indeed an almost self-evident truth, that our trade with the countries lying beyond the Cape of Good Hope could be advantageously carried on only by means of a great joint stock company. There was no analogy, it was said, between our European trade and our Indian trade. Our government had diplomatic relations with the European states. If necessary, a maritime force could easily be sent from hence to the mouth of the Elbe or of the Tagus. But the English kings had no envoy at the court of Agra or Pekin. There was seldom a single English man of war within 10,000 miles of the Bay of Bengal or of the Gulf of Siam. As our merchants could not, in those remote seas, be protected by their sovereign, they must protect themselves, and must, for that end, exercise some of the rights of sovereignty. They must have forts, garrisons, and armed ships. They must have power to send and receive embassies, to make a treaty of alliance with one Asiatic prince, to wage war on another. It was evidently impossible that every merchant should have this power independently of the rest. The merchants trading to India must therefore be joined together in a corporation which could act as one main. In support of these arguments, the example of the Dutch was cited, and was generally considered as decisive. For in that age the immense prosperity of Holland was everywhere regarded with admiration, not the less earnest because it was largely mingled with envy and hatred. In all that related to trade, her statesmen were considered as oracles, and her institutions as models. The great majority, therefore, of those who assailed the company assailed it, not because it traded on joint funds and possessed exclusive privileges, but because it was ruled by one man, and because his rule had been mischievous to the public, and beneficial only to himself and his creatures. The obvious remedy, it was said, for the evils which his maladministration had produced was to transfer the monopoly to a new corporation so constituted as to be in no danger of falling under the dominion either of a despot or of a narrow oligarchy. Many persons who were desirous to be members of such a corporation formed themselves into a society, signed an engagement, and entrusted the care of their interests to a committee which contained some of the chief traders of the city. This society, though it had in the eye of the law no personality, was early designated, in popular speech, as the New Company, and the hostilities between the New Company and the Old Company soon caused almost as much excitement and anxiety, at least in that busy hive of which the Royal Exchange was the centre, as the hostilities between the Allies and the French King. The headquarters of the younger association were in Dowgate. The Skinners lent their stately hall, and the meetings were held in a parlour renowned for the fragrance which exhaled from a magnificent wainscot of cedar. While the contention was hottest, important news arrived from India, and was announced in the London Gazette as in the highest degree satisfactory. Peace had been concluded between the Great Mogul and the English. That mighty potentate had not only withdrawn his troops from the factories, but had bestowed on the company privileges such as it had never before enjoyed. Soon, however, appeared a very different version of the story. The enemies of Child had, before this time, accused him of systematically publishing false intelligence. He had now, they said, outlied himself. They had obtained a true copy of the firman which had put an end to the war, and they printed a translation of it. It appeared that Aurengzebe had contemptuously granted to the English, in consideration of their penitence and of a large tribute, his forgiveness for their past delinquency, had charged them to behave themselves better for the future, and had, in the tone of a master, laid on them his commands to remove the principal offender, Sir John Child, from power and trust. The death of Sir John occurred so seasonably that these commands could not be obeyed. But it was only too evident that the pacification which the rulers of the India House had represented as advantageous and honourable had really been effected on terms disgraceful to the English name. During the summer of 1691, the controversy which raged on this subject between the Leadenhall Street Company and the Dowgate Company kept the city in constant agitation. In the autumn the Parliament had no sooner met than both the contending parties presented petitions to the House of Commons. The petitions were immediately taken into serious consideration, and resolutions of grave importance were passed. The first resolution was that the trade with the East Indies was beneficial to the kingdom. The second was that the trade with the East Indies would be best carried on by a joint stock company possessed of exclusive privileges. It was plain, therefore, that neither those manufacturers who wished to prohibit the trade, nor those merchants at the outports who wished to throw it open, had the smallest chance of attaining their objects. The only question left was the question between the old and the new company. 17 years elapsed before that question ceased to disturb both political and commercial circles. It was fatal to the honour and power of one great minister, and to the peace and prosperity of many private families. The tracts which the rival bodies put forth against each other were innumerable. If the drama of that age may be trusted, the feud between the India House and Skinner's Hall was sometimes as serious an impediment to the course of true love in London as the feud of the Capulets and Montagues had been at Verona. Which of the two contending parties was the stronger, it is not easy to say. The new company was supported by the Whigs, the old company by the Tories. The new company was popular, for it promised largely and could not be accused of having broken its promises. It made no dividends, and therefore was not envied. It had no power to oppress, and had therefore been guilty of no oppression. The old company, though generally regarded with little favour by the public, had the immense advantage of being in possession, and of having only to stand on the defensive. The burden of framing a plan for the regulation of the India trade, and of proving that plan to be better than the plan hitherto followed, lay on the new company. The old company had merely to find objections to every change that was proposed, and such objections there was little difficulty in finding. The members of the new company were ill provided with the means of purchasing support at court and in Parliament. They had no corporate existence, no common treasury. If any of them gave a bribe, he gave it out of his own pocket, with little chance of being reimbursed. But the old company, though surrounded by dangers, still held its exclusive privileges, and still made its enormous profits. Its stock had indeed gone down greatly in value since the golden days of Charles II, but £100 still sold for 122. After a large dividend had been paid to the proprietors, a surplus remained amply sufficient, in those days, to corrupt half a cabinet, and this surplus was absolutely at the disposal of one able, determined and unscrupulous man, who maintained the fight with wonderful art and pertinacity. The majority of the Commons wished to effect a compromise, to retain the old company, but to remodel it, to impose on it new conditions, and to incorporate with it the members of the new company. With this view it was, after long and vehement debates and close divisions, resolved that the capital should be increased to 1.5 million. In order to prevent a single person or small junto from domineering over the whole society, it was determined that £5,000 of stock should be the largest quantity that any single proprietor could hold, and that those who held more should be required to sell the overplus at any price not below par. In return for the exclusive privilege of trading to the eastern seas, the company was to be required to furnish annually 500 tons of saltpetre to the Crown at a low price, and to export annually English manufactures to the value of £200,000. A bill founded on these resolutions was brought in, read twice, and committed, but was suffered to drop in consequence of the positive refusal of Child and his associates to accept the offered terms. He objected to every part of the plan, and his objections are highly curious and amusing. The great monopolist took his stand on the principles of free trade. In a luminous and powerfully written paper, he exposed the absurdity of the expedients which the House of Commons had devised. To limit the amount of stock which might stand in a single name would, he said, be most unreasonable. Surely a proprietor whose whole fortune was staked on the success of the Indian trade was far more likely to exert all his faculties vigorously for the promotion of that trade than a proprietor who had risked only what it would be no great disaster to lose. The demand that saltpetre should be furnished to the Crown for a fixed sum, Child met by those arguments, familiar to our generation, which prove that prices should be left to settle themselves. To the demand that the Company should bind itself to export annually £200,000 worth of English manufactures, he very properly replied that the Company would most gladly export 2 millions worth if the market required such a supply, and that, if the market were overstocked, it would be mere folly to send good cloth half round the world to be eaten by white ants. It was never, he declared with much spirit, found politic to put trade into straight-laced bodices, which, instead of making it grow upright and thrive, must either kill it or force it awry. The Commons, irritated by Child's obstinacy, presented an address requesting the King to dissolve the old Company and to grant a charter to a new Company on such terms as to His Majesty's wisdom might seem fit. It is plainly implied in the terms of this address that the Commons thought the King constitutionally competent to grant an exclusive privilege of trading to the East Indies. The King replied that the subject was most important, that he would consider it maturely, and that he would, at a future time, give the House a more precise answer. In Parliament nothing more was said on the subject during that session, but out of Parliament the war was fiercer than ever, and the belligerents were by no means scrupulous about the means which they employed. The chief weapons of the new Company were libels. The chief weapons of the old Company were bribes. In the same week in which the bill for the regulation of the Indian trade was suffered to drop, another bill which had produced great excitement and had called forth an almost unprecedented display of parliamentary ability underwent the same fate. During the 8 years which preceded the Revolution, the Whigs had complained bitterly, and not more bitterly than justly, of the hard measure dealt out to persons accused of political offences. Was it not monstrous, they asked, that a culprit should be denied a sight of his indictment? Often an unhappy prisoner had not known of what he was accused till he had held up his hand at the bar. The crime imputed to him might be plotting to shoot the King. It might be plotting to poison the King. The more innocent the defendant was, the less likely he was to guess the nature of the charge on which he was to be tried. And how could he have evidence ready to rebut a charge the nature of which he could not guess? The Crown had power to compel the attendance of witnesses. The prisoner had no such power. If witnesses voluntarily came forward to speak in his favour, they could not be sworn. Their testimony therefore made less impression on a jury than the testimony of the witnesses for the prosecution, whose veracity was guaranteed by the most solemn sanctions of law and of religion. The juries, carefully selected by sheriffs whom the Crown had named, were men animated by the fiercest party spirit, men who had as little tenderness for an exclusionist of a dissenter as for a mad dog. The government was served by a band of able, experienced and unprincipled lawyers, who could, by merely glancing over a brief, distinguish every weak and every strong point of a case, whose presence of mind never failed them, whose flow of speech was inexhaustible, and who had passed their lives in dressing up the worst reason so as to make it appear the better. Was it not horrible to see 3 or 4 of these shrewd, learned, and callous orators arrayed against one poor wretch who had never in his life uttered a word in public, who was ignorant of the legal definition of treason and of the first principles of the law of evidence, and whose intellect, unequal at best to a fencing match with professional gladiators, was confused by the near prospect of a cruel and ignominious death? Such, however, was the rule, and even for a man so much stupefied by sickness that he could not hold up his hand or make his voice heard, even for a poor old woman who understood nothing of what was passing except that she was going to be roasted alive for doing an act of charity, no advocate was suffered to utter a word. That a state trial so conducted was little better than a judicial murder had been, during the proscription of the Whig party, a fundamental article of the Whig creed. The Tories, on the other hand, though they could not deny that there had been some hard cases, maintained that, on the whole, substantial justice had been done. Perhaps a few seditious persons who had gone very near to the frontier of treason, but had not actually passed that frontier, might have suffered as traitors. But was that a sufficient reason for enabling the chiefs of the Rye House plot and of the Western insurrection to elude, by mere chicanery, the punishment of their guilt? On what principle was the traitor to have chances of escape which were not allowed to the felon? The culprit who was accused of larceny was subject to all the same disadvantages which, in the case of regicides and rebels, were thought so unjust. Yet nobody pitied him. Nobody thought it monstrous that he should not have time to study a copy of his indictment, that his witness should be examined without being sworn, that he should be left to defend himself, without the help of counsel against the best abilities which the Inns of Court could furnish. The Whigs, it seemed, reserved all their compassion for those crimes which subvert government and dissolve the whole frame of human society. Guy Faux was to be treated with an indulgence which was not to be extended to a shoplifter. Bradshaw was to have privileges which were refused to a boy who had robbed a hen roost. The Revolution produced, as was natural, some change in the sentiments of both the great parties. In the days when none but Roundheads and Nonconformists were accused of treason, even the most humane and upright Cavaliers were disposed to think that the laws which were the safeguard of the throne could hardly be too severe. But, as soon as loyal Tory gentlemen and venerable fathers of the Church were in danger of being called in question for corresponding with Saint Germains, a new light flashed on many understandings which had been unable to discover the smallest injustice in the proceedings against Algernon Sidney and Alice Lisle. It was no longer thought utterly absurd to maintain that some advantages which were withheld from a man accused of felony might reasonably be allowed to a man accused of treason. What probability was there that any sheriff would pack a jury, that any barrister would employ all the arts of sophistry and rhetoric, that any judge would strain law and misrepresent evidence, in order to convict an innocent person of burglary or sheep-stealing? But on a trial for high treason a verdict of acquittal must always be considered as a defeat of the government; and there was but too much reason to fear that many sheriffs, barristers and judges might be impelled by party spirit, or by some baser motive, to do any thing which might save the government from the inconvenience and shame of a defeat. The cry of the whole body of Tories was that the lives of good Englishmen who happened to be obnoxious to the ruling powers were not sufficiently protected; and this cry was swelled by the voices of some lawyers who had distinguished themselves by the malignant zeal and dishonest ingenuity with which they had conducted state prosecutions in the days of Charles and James. End of Section 3. Recording by John Raimundo.
Of Chapter 18 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay, Chapter 18, Section 4. The feeling of the Whigs, though it had not, like the feeling of the Tories, undergone a complete change, was yet not quite what it had been. Some, who had thought it most unjust that Russell should have no counsel and that Cornish should have no copy of his indictment, now began to mutter that the times had changed, that the dangers of the state were extreme, that liberty, property, religion, national independence were all at stake, that many Englishmen were engaged in schemes of which the object was to make England the slave of France and of Rome, and that it would be most unwise to relax at such a moment the laws against political offences. It was true that the injustice with which in the late reigns state trials had been conducted had given great scandal, but this injustice was to be ascribed to the bad kings and bad judges with whom the nation had been cursed. William was now on the throne. Holt was seated for life on the bench, and William would never exact, nor would Holt ever perform, services so shameful and wicked as those for which the banished tyrant had rewarded Jeffreys with riches and titles. This language, however, was at first held but by few. The Whigs, as a party, seem to have felt they could not honourably defend, in the season of their prosperity, what, in the time of their adversity, they had always designated as a crying grievance. A bill for regulating trials in cases of high treason was brought into the House of Commons, and was received with general applause. Treby had the courage to make some objections, but no division took place. The chief enactments were that no person should be convicted of high treason committed more than 3 years before the indictment was found, that every person indicted for high treason should be allowed to avail himself of the assistance of counsel, and should be furnished 10 days before the trial with a copy of the indictment, and with a list of the freeholders from among whom the jury was to be taken, that his witnesses should be sworn, and that they should be cited by the same process by which the attendance of the witnesses against him was secured. The bill went to the Upper House, and came back with an important amendment. The Lords had long complained of the anomalous and iniquitous constitution of that tribunal which had jurisdiction over them in cases of life and death. When a grand jury has found a bill of indictment against a temporal peer for any offence higher than a misdemeanour, the Crown appoints a Lord High Steward, and in the Lord High Steward's court the case is tried. This court was anciently composed in two very different ways. It consisted, if Parliament happened to be sitting, of all the members of the Upper House. When Parliament was not sitting, the Lord High Steward summoned any 12 or more peers at his discretion to form a jury. The consequence was that a peer accused of high treason during a recess was tried by a jury which his prosecutors had packed. The Lords now demanded that during a recess, as well as during a session, every peer accused of high treason should be tried by the whole body of the peerage. The demand was resisted by the House of Commons with vehemence and obstinacy which men of the present generation may find it difficult to understand. The truth is that some invidious privileges of peerage which have since been abolished, and others which have since fallen into entire desuetude, were then in full force and were daily used. No gentleman who had had a dispute with a nobleman could think without indignation of the advantages enjoyed by the favoured caste. If his lordship were sued at law, his privilege enabled him to impede the course of justice. If a rude word were spoken of him, such a word as he might himself utter with perfect impunity, he might vindicate his insulted dignity both by civil and criminal proceedings. If a barrister, in the discharge of his duty to a client, spoke with severity of the conduct of a noble seducer, if an honest squire on the racecourse applied the proper epithets to the tricks of a noble swindler, the affronted patrician had only to complain to the proud and powerful body of which he was a member. His brethren made his cause their own. The offender was taken into custody by black rod, brought to the bar, flung into prison, and kept there till he was glad to obtain forgiveness by the most degrading submissions. Nothing could therefore be more natural than that an attempt of the peers to obtain any new advantage for their order should be regarded by the Commons with extreme jealousy. There is strong reason to suspect that some able Whig politicians, who thought it dangerous to relax, at that moment, the laws against political offences, but who could not, without incurring the charge of inconsistency, declare themselves adverse to any relaxation, had conceived a hope that they might, by fomenting the dispute about the court of the Lord High Steward, defer for at least a year the passing of a bill which they disliked, and yet could not decently oppose. If this really was their plan, it succeeded perfectly. The Lower House rejected the amendment. The Upper House persisted. A free conference was held, and the question was argued with great force and ingenuity on both sides. The reasons in favour of the amendment are obvious, and indeed at first sight seem unanswerable. It was surely difficult to defend a system under which the Sovereign nominated a conclave of his own creatures to decide the fate of men whom he regarded as his mortal enemies. And could anything be more absurd than that a nobleman accused of high treason should be entitled to be tried by the whole body of his peers if his indictment happened to be brought into the House of Lords the minute before a prorogation, but that, if the indictment arrived a minute after the prorogation, he should be at the mercy of a small junto named by the very authority which prosecuted him? That anything could have been said on the other side seems strange. But those who managed the conference for the Commons were not ordinary men, and seem on this occasion to have put forth all their powers. Conspicuous among them was Charles Montague, who was rapidly attaining a foremost rank among the orators of that age. To him the lead seems on this occasion to have been left, and to his pen we owe an account of the discussion, which gives a very high notion of his talents for debate. We have framed, such was in substance his reasoning, we have framed a law which has in it nothing exclusive, a law which will be a blessing to every class, from the highest to the lowest. The new securities which we propose to give to innocents oppressed by power are common between the premier peer and the humblest day labourer. The clause which establishes a time of limitation for prosecutions protects us all alike. To every Englishman accused of the highest crime against the state, whatever be his rank, we give the privilege of seeing his indictment, the privilege of being defended by counsel, the privilege of having his witnesses summoned by writ of subpoena and sworn on the Holy Gospels. Such is the bill which we sent up to your lordships, and you return it to us with a clause of which the effect is to give certain advantages to your noble order at the expense of the ancient prerogatives of the Crown. Surely before we consent to take away from the King any power which his predecessors have possessed for ages, and to give it to your lordships, we ought to be satisfied that you are more likely to use it well than he. Something we must risk, somebody we must trust, and since we are forced, much against our will, to institute what is necessarily an invidious comparison, we must own ourselves unable to discover any reason for believing that a prince is less to be trusted than an aristocracy. Is it reasonable, you ask, that you should be tried for your lives before a few members of your house selected by the Crown? Is it reasonable, we ask in our turn, that you should have the privilege of being tried by all the members of your house, that is to say, by your brothers, your uncles, your first cousins, your second cousins, your fathers-in-law, your brothers-in-law, your most intimate friends? You marry so much into each other's families, you live so much in each other's society, that there is scarcely a nobleman who is not connected by consanguinity or affinity with several others, and who is not on terms of friendship with several more. There have been great men whose death put a third or fourth part of the baronage of England into mourning. Nor is there much danger that even those peers who may be unconnected with an accused lord will be disposed to send him to the block if they can with decency say, "Not guilty, upon my honour," for the ignominious death of a single member of a small aristocratical body necessarily leaves a stain on the reputation of his fellows. If, indeed, your lordships propose that every one of your body should be compelled to attend and vote, the Crown might have some chance of obtaining justice against a guilty peer, however strongly connected. But you propose that attendance shall be voluntary. Is it possible to doubt what the consequence will be? All the prisoner's relations and friends will be in their places to vote for him. Good nature and the fear of making powerful enemies will keep away many who, if they voted at all, would be forced by conscience and honour to vote against him. The new system which you propose would therefore evidently be unfair to the Crown. and you do not show any reason for believing that the old system has been found in practice unfair to yourselves. We may confidently affirm that even under a government less just and merciful than that under which we have the happiness to live, an innocent peer has little to fear from any set of peers that can be brought together in Westminster Hall to try him. How stands the fact? In what single case has a guiltless head fallen by the verdict of this packed jury? It would be easy to make out a long list of squires, merchants, lawyers, surgeons, yeomen, artisans, ploughmen, whose blood, barbarously shed during the late evil times, cries for vengeance to heaven. But what single member of your house in our days, or in the days of our fathers, or in the days of our grandfathers, suffered death unjustly by sequence of the court of the Lord High Steward? Hundreds of the common people were sent to the gallows by common juries for the Rye House plot and the Western insurrection. One peer, and one alone, my Lord Delamere, was brought at that time before the court of the Lord High Steward, and he was acquitted. But it is said the evidence against him was legally insufficient. Be it so. So was the evidence against Sidney, against Cornish, against Alice Lisle, yet it sufficed to destroy them. But, it is said, the peers before whom my Lord Delamere was brought were selected with shameless unfairness by King James and by Jeffreys. Be it so. But this only proves that under the worst possible king, and under the worst possible High Steward, a lord tried by lords has a better chance for life than a commoner who puts himself on his country. We cannot, therefore, under the mild government which we now possess, feel much apprehension for the safety of any innocent peer. Would that we felt as little apprehension for the safety of that government! But it is notorious that the settlement with which our liberties are inseparably bound up is attacked at once by foreign and by domestic enemies. We cannot consent at such a crisis to relax the restraints which have, it may well be feared, already proved too feeble to prevent some men of high rank from plotting the ruin of their country. To sum up the whole, what is asked of us is that we will consent to transfer a certain power from their Majesties to your Lordships. Our answer is that, at this time, in our opinion, their Majesties have not too much power, and your Lordships have quite power enough. These arguments, though eminently ingenious, and not without real force, failed to convince the Upper House. The Lords insisted that every peer should be entitled to be a trier. The Commons were with difficulty induced to consent that the number of triers should never be less than 36, and positively refused to make any further concession. The bill was therefore suffered to drop. It is certain that those who in the conference on this bill represented the Commons did not exaggerate the dangers to which the government was exposed. While the constitution of the court which was to try peers for treason was under discussion, a treason planned with rare skill by a peer was all but carried into execution. Marlborough had never ceased to assure that the court of Saint-Germains that the great crime which he had committed was constantly present to his thoughts, and that he lived only for the purpose of repentance and reparation. Not only had he himself been converted, he had also converted the Princess Anne. In 1688 the Churchills had, with little difficulty, induced her to fly from her father's palace. In 1691 they, with as little difficulty, induced her to copy out and sign a letter expressing her deep concern for his misfortunes and her earnest wish to atone for her breach of duty. At the same time Marlborough held out hopes that it might be in his power to effect the restoration of his old master in the best possible way, without the help of a single foreign soldier or sailor. By the votes of the English Lords and Commons, and by the support of the English army. We are not fully informed as to all the details of his plan, but the outline is known to us from a most interesting paper written by James, of which one copy is in the Bodleian Library, and another among the archives of the French Foreign Office. The jealousy with which the English regarded the Dutch was at this time intense. There had never been a hearty friendship between the nations. They were indeed near of kin to each other. They spoke two dialects of one widespread language. Both boasted of their political freedom. Both were attached to the Reformed faith. Both were threatened by the same enemy, and would be safe only while they were united. Yet there was no cordial feeling between them. They would probably have loved each other more if they had in some respects resembled each other less. They were the two great commercial nations, the two great maritime nations. In every sea their flags were found together, in the Baltic and in the Mediterranean, in the Gulf of Mexico and in the Straits of Malacca. Everywhere the merchant of London and the merchant of Amsterdam were trying to forestall each other and to undersell each other. In Europe the contest was not sanguinary, but too often, in barbarous countries where there was no law but force, the competitors had met, burning with cupidity, burning with animosity, armed for battle, each suspecting the other of hostile design, and each resolved to give the other no advantage. In such circumstances it is not strange that many violent and cruel acts should have been perpetrated. What had been done in those distant regions could seldom be exactly known in Europe. Everything was exaggerated and distorted by vague report and by national prejudice. Here it was the popular belief that the English were always blameless, and that every quarrel was to be ascribed to the avarice and inhumanity of the Dutch. Lamentable events which had taken place in the Spice Islands were repeatedly brought on our stage. The Englishmen were all saints and heroes, the Dutchmen all fiends in human shape, lying, robbing, ravishing, murdering, torturing. The angry passions which these pieces indicated had more than once found vent in war. Thrice in the lifetime of one generation the two nations had contended, with equal courage and with various fortune, for the sovereignty of the German Ocean. The tyranny of James, as it had reconciled Tories to Whigs and Churchmen to Nonconformists, had also reconciled the English to the Dutch. While our ancestors were looking to the Hague for deliverance, the massacre of Amboyna and the great humiliation of Chatham had seemed to be forgotten. But since the Revolution the old feeling had revived. Though England and Holland were now closely bound together by treaty, they were as far as ever from being bound together by affection. Once, just after the Battle of Beachy Head, our countrymen had seemed disposed to be just, but a violent reaction speedily followed. Torrington, who deserved to be shot, became a popular favourite, and the allies whom he shamefully abandoned were accused of persecuting him without a cause. The partiality shown by the King to the companions of his youth was the favourite theme of the sowers of sedition. The most lucrative posts in his household, it was said, were held by Dutchmen. The House of Lords was fast filling with Dutchmen. The finest manors of the crown were given to Dutchmen. The army was commanded by Dutchmen. That it would have been wise in William to exhibit somewhat less obtrusively his laudable fondness for his native country, and to remunerate his early friends somewhat more sparingly, is perfectly true, but it will not be easy to prove that on any important occasion during his whole reign he sacrificed the interests of our island to the interests of the United Provinces. The English, however, were on this subject prone to fits of jealousy which made them quite incapable of listening to reason. One of the sharpest of those fits came on in the autumn of 1691. The antipathy to the Dutch was at that time strong in all classes, and nowhere stronger than in the Parliament and in the army. End of section 4.
Number 5 of Chapter 18 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill McGovern. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay, Chapter 18. Of that antipathy, Marlborough determined to avail himself for the purpose, as he assured James and James's adherents, of effecting a restoration. The temper of both houses was such that they might not improbably be induced by skilful management to present a joint address requesting that all foreigners might be dismissed from the service of their Majesties. Marlborough undertook to move such an address in the Lords, and there would have been no difficulty in finding some gentleman of great weight to make a similar motion in the Commons. If the address should be carried, what could William do? Would he yield? Would he discard all his dearest, his oldest, his most trusty friends? It was hardly possible to believe that he would make so painful, so humiliating a concession. If he did not yield, there would be a rupture between him and the Parliament, and the Parliament would be backed by the people. Even a king reigning by a hereditary title might well shrink from such a contest with the estates of the realm. But to a king whose title rested on a resolution of the estates of the realm, such a contest must almost necessarily be fatal. The last hope of William would be in the army. The army Marlborough undertook to manage, and it is highly probable that what he undertook he could have performed. His courage, his abilities, his noble and winning manners, the splendid success which had attended him on every occasion on which he had been in command, had made him, in spite of his sordid vices, a favourite with his brethren in arms. They were proud of having one countryman who had shown that he wanted nothing more but opportunity to vie with the ablest Marshal of France. The Dutch were even more disliked by the English troops than by the English nation generally. Had Marlborough, therefore, after securing the co-operation of some distinguished officers, presented himself at the critical moment to those regiments which he had led to victory in Flanders and in Ireland, had he called on them to rally round him, to protect the Parliament, to drive out the aliens, there is strong reason to think that the call would have been obeyed. He would then have had it in his power to fulfil the promises which he had so solemnly made to his old master. Of all the schemes ever formed for the restoration of James or of his descendants, this scheme promised the fairest. That national pride, that hatred of arbitrary power, which had hitherto been on William's side, would now be turned against him. Hundreds of thousands who would have put their lives in jeopardy to prevent a French army from imposing a government on the English would have felt no disposition to prevent an English army from driving out the Dutch. Even the Whigs could scarcely, without renouncing their old doctrines, support a prince who obstinately refused to comply with the general wish of his people, signified to him by his Parliament. The plot looked well. An active canvass was made. Many members of the House of Commons, who did not at all suspect that there was any ulterior design, promised to vote against the foreigners. Marlborough was indefatigable in inflaming the discontents of the army. His house was constantly filled with officers who heated each other into fury by talking against the Dutch. But before the preparations were complete, a strange suspicion arose in the minds of some of the Jacobites. That the author of this bold and artful scheme wished to pull down the existing government, there could be little doubt. But was it quite certain what government he meant to set up? Might he not depose William without restoring James? Was it not possible that a man so wise, so aspiring, and so wicked might be meditating a double treason, such as would have been thought a masterpiece of statecraft by the great Italian politicians of the 15th century, such as Borgia would have envied, and such as Machiavel would have extolled to the skies? What if this consummate dissembler should cheat both the rival kings? What if, when he found himself commander of the army and protector of the Parliament, he should proclaim Queen Anne? Was it not possible that the weary and harassed nation might gladly acquiesce in such a settlement? James was unpopular because he was a Papist, influenced by Popish priests. William was unpopular because he was a foreigner, attached to foreign favourites. Anne was at once a Protestant and an Englishwoman. Under her government the country would be in no danger of being overrun either by Jesuits or by Dutchmen. That Marlborough had the strongest motives for placing her on the throne was evident. He could never, in the court of her father, be more than a repentant criminal, whose services were overpaid by a pardon. In her court, the husband of her adored friend would be what Pepin Heristal and Charles Martel had been to the Chilperics and Childeberts. He would be the chief director of the civil and military government. He would wield the whole power of England. He would hold the balance of Europe. Great kings and commonwealths would bid against each other for his favour, and exhaust their treasuries in the vain hope of satiating his avarice. The presumption was, therefore, that, if he had the English crown in his hands, he would put it on the head of the princess. What evidence there was to confirm this presumption is not known, but it is certain that something took place which convinced some of the most devoted friends of the exiled family that he was meditating a second perfidy, surpassing even the feat which he had performed at Salisbury. They were afraid that if, at the moment, they succeeded in getting rid of William, the situation of James would be more hopeless than ever. So fully were they persuaded of the duplicity of their accomplice that they not only refused to proceed further in the execution of the plan which he had formed, but disclosed his whole scheme to Portland. William seems to have been alarmed and provoked by this intelligence to a degree very unusual with him. In general, he was indulgent, nay, wilfully blind to the baseness of the English statesmen whom he employed. He suspected, indeed he knew, that some of his servants were in correspondence with his competitor, and yet he did not punish them, did not disgrace them, did not even frown on them. He thought meanly, and he had but too good reason for thinking meanly, of the whole of that breed of public men which the Restoration had formed and had bequeathed to the Revolution. He knew them too well to complain because he did not find in them veracity, fidelity, consistency, disinterestedness. The very utmost that he expected from them was that they would serve him as far as they could serve him without serious danger to themselves. If he had learned that, while sitting in his council and enriched by his bounty, they were trying to make for themselves at Saint-Germain an interest which might be of use to them in the event of a counter-revolution, he was more inclined to bestow on them the contemptuous commendation which was bestowed of old on the worldly wisdom of the unjust Steward, than to call them to a severe account. But the crime of Marlborough was of a very different kind. His treason was not that of a faint-hearted man desirous to keep a retreat open for himself in every event, but that of a man of dauntless courage, profound policy, and measureless ambition. William was not prone to fear, but if there was anything on earth that he feared, it was Marlborough. To treat the criminal as he deserved was indeed impossible, for those by whom his designs had been made known to the government would never have consented to appear against him in the witness box, but to permit him to retain high command in that army which he was then engaged in seducing would have been madness. Late in the evening of the 9th of January, the Queen had a painful explanation with the Princess Anne. Early in the morning, Marlborough was informed that their Majesties had no further occasion for his services, and that he must not presume to appear in the royal presence. He had been loaded with honours, and with what he loved better, riches. All was at once taken away. The real history of these events was known to very few. Evelyn, who had in general excellent sources of information, believed that the corruption and extortion of which Marlborough was notoriously guilty had roused the royal indignation. The Dutch ministers could only tell the States General that 6 different stories were being spread abroad by Marlborough's enemies. Some said that he had indiscreetly suffered an important military secret to escape him. Some that he had spoken disrespectfully of their Majesties. Some that he had done ill offices between the Queen and the Princess. Some that he had been forming cabals in the army. Some that he had carried on an unauthorized correspondence with the Danish government about the general politics of Europe, and some that he had been trafficking with the agent of the court of Saint-Germain. His friends contradicted every one of these stories and affirmed that his only crime was his dislike of the foreigners who were lording it over his countrymen, and that he had fallen a victim to the machinations of Portland, whom he was known to dislike, and whom he had not very politely described as a wooden fellow. The mystery which from the first overhung the story of Marlborough's disgrace was darkened, after the lapse of 50 years, by the shameless mendacity of his widow. The concise narrative of James dispels the mystery, and makes it clear not only why Marlborough was disgraced, but also how several of the reports about the cause of his disgrace originated. Though William assigned to the public no reason for exercising his undoubted prerogative by dismissing his servant, Anne had been informed of the truth, and it had been left to her to judge whether an officer who had been guilty of a foul treason was a fit inmate of the palace. 3 weeks passed. Lady Marlborough still retained her post in her apartments at Whitehall. Her husband still resided with her, and still the King and Queen gave no sign of displeasure. At length the haughty and vindictive Countess, emboldened by their patience, determined to brave them face to face, and accompanied her mistress one evening to the drawing-room at Kensington. This was too much even for the gentle Mary. She would indeed have expressed her indignation before the crowd which surrounded the card-tables, had she not remembered that her sister was in a state which entitles women to peculiar indulgence. Nothing was said that night, but on the following day a letter from the Queen was delivered to the princes. Mary declared that she was unwilling to give pain to a sister whom she loved, and in whom she could easily pass over any ordinary fault, but this was a serious matter. Lady Marlborough must be dismissed. While she lived at Whitehall, her lord would live there. Was it proper that a man in his situation should be suffered to make the palace of his injured master his home? Yet so unwilling was His Majesty to deal severely with the worst offenders, that even this had been borne, and might have been borne longer, had not Anne thought the Countess to defy the King and the Queen in their own presence chamber. It was unkind, Mary wrote in a sister. It would have been uncivil in an equal, and I need not say that I have more to claim. The Princess, in her answer, did not attempt to exculpate or excuse Marlborough, but expressed a firm conviction that his wife was innocent, and implored the Queen not to insist on so heartrending a separation. There is no misery, Anne wrote, that I cannot resolve to suffer, rather than the thoughts of parting from her. The princess sent for her uncle Rochester, and implored him to carry her letter to Kensington, and to be her advocate there. Rochester declined the office of messenger, and, though he tried to restore harmony between his kinswomen, was by no means disposed to plead the cause of the Churchills. He had indeed long seen with extreme uneasiness the absolute dominion exercised over his younger niece by that unprincipled pair. Anne's expostulation was sent to the Queen by a servant. The only reply was a message from the Lord Chamberlain, Dorset, commanding Lady Marlborough to leave the palace. Mrs. Morley would not be separated from Mrs. Freeman. As to Mr. Morley, all places where he could have his 3 courses and his 3 bottles were alike to him. The princess and her whole family therefore retired to Sion House, a villa belonging to the Duke of Somerset, and situated on the margin of the Thames. In London she occupied Berkeley House, which stood in Piccadilly, on the site now covered by Devonshire House. Her income was secured by Act of Parliament, but no punishment which it was in the power of the Crown to inflict on her was spared. Her guard of honour was taken away. The foreign ministers ceased to wait upon her. When she went to Bath, the Secretary of State wrote to request that the mayor of that city not to receive her with the ceremonial with which royal visitors were usually welcomed. When she attended divine service at St. James' Church, she found that the rector had been forbidden to show her the customary marks of respect, to bow to her from his pulpit, and to send a copy of his text to be laid on her cushion. Even the bellman of Piccadilly, it was said, perhaps falsely, was ordered not to chant her praises in his doggerel verse under the windows of Berkeley House. That Anne was in the wrong is clear, but it is not equally clear that the King and Queen were in the right. They should either have dissembled their displeasure or openly declared the true reasons for it. Unfortunately, they let everybody see the punishment, and they let scarcely anybody know the provocation. They should have remembered that in the absence of information about the cause of a quarrel, the public is naturally inclined to side with the weaker party, and that this inclination is likely to be peculiarly strong when a sister is, without any apparent reason, harshly treated by a sister. They should have remembered, too, that they were exposing to attack what was unfortunately the one vulnerable part of Mary's character. A cruel fate had put enmity between her and her father. Her detractors pronounced her utterly destitute of natural affection, and even her eulogists, when they spoke of the way in which she had discharged the duties of a filial relation, were forced to speak in a subdued and apologetic tone. Nothing, therefore, could be more unfortunate than that she should a second time appear mindful of the ties of consanguinity. She was now at open war with both the 2 persons who were nearest to her in blood. Many who thought that her conduct toward her parent was justified by the extreme danger which had threatened her country and her religion, were unable to defend her conduct towards her sister. While Mary, who was really guilty in this matter of nothing more than imprudence, was regarded by the world as an oppressor, Anne, who was as culpable as her small faculties enabled her to be, assumed the interesting character of a meek, resigned sufferer. In those private letters, indeed, to which the name of Morley was subscribed, the princess expressed the sentiments of a fury in the style of a fishwoman, railed savagely at the whole Dutch nation, and called her brother-in-law sometimes the abortion, sometimes the monster, sometimes Caliban. But the nation heard nothing of her language, and saw nothing of her deportment but what was decorous and submissive. The truth seems to have been that the rancorous and coarse-minded countess gave the tone to her Highness's confidential correspondence, while the graceful, serene, and politic Earl was suffered to prescribe the course which was to be taken before the public eye. During a short time the Queen was generally blamed, but the charm of her temper and manners was irresistible. In a few months she regained the popularity which she had lost. It was a most fortunate circumstance for Marlborough that, just at the very time when all London was talking about his disgrace, and trying to guess at the cause of the King's sudden anger against one who had always seemed to be a favourite, An accusation of treason was brought by William Fuller against many persons of high consideration, was strictly investigated, and was proved to be false and malicious. The consequence was that the public, which rarely discriminates nicely, could not at that moment be easily brought to believe in the reality of any Jacobite conspiracy. That Fuller's plot is less celebrated than the Popish plot is rather the fault of the historians than of Fuller, who did all that man could do to secure an eminent place among villains. Every person well read in history must have observed that depravity has its temporary modes, which come in and go out like modes of dress and upholstery. It may be doubted whether in our country any man ever before the year 1678 invented and related on oath a circumstantial history, altogether fictitious, of a treasonable plot for the purpose of making himself important by destroying men who had given him no provocation. But in the year 1678 this execrable crime became the fashion, and continued to be so during the 20 years which followed. Preachers designated it as our peculiar national sin, and prophesied that it would draw on us some awful national judgment. Legislators proposed new punishments of terrible severity for this new atrocity. It was not, however, found necessary to resort to those punishments. The fashion changed, and during the last century and a half there has perhaps not been a single instance of this particular kind of wickedness. The explanation is simple. Oates was the founder of a school. His success proved that no romance is too wild to be received with faith by understandings which fear and hatred have disordered. His slanders were monstrous, but they were well timed. He spoke to a people made credulous by their passions, and thus, by impudent and cruel lying, he raised himself in a week from beggary and obscurity to luxury, renown and power. He had once eked out the small tithes of a miserable vicarage by stealing the pigs and fowls of his parishioners. He was now lodged in a palace. He was followed by admiring crowds. He had at his mercy the estates and lives of Howards and Herberts. A crowd of imitators instantly appeared. It seemed that much more might be got, and that much less was risked, by testifying to an imaginary conspiracy than by robbing on the highway or clipping the coin. Accordingly, the Bedloes, Dangerfields, and Dugdales, Turbervilles, made haste to transfer their industry to an employment at once more profitable and less perilous than any to which they were accustomed. Till the dissolution of the Oxford Parliament, Popish plots were the chief manufacture. Then, during 7 years, Whig plots were the only plots which paid. After the Revolution, Jacobite plots came in, but the public had become cautious, and though the new false witnesses were in no respect less artful than their predecessors, they found much less encouragement. The history of the first great check given to the practices of this abandoned race of men well deserves to be circumstantially related. End of section 5.
Of chapter 18 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay, Chapter 18, Section 6. In 1689, and in the beginning of 1690, William Fuller had rendered to the government service such as the best governments sometimes require, and such as none but the worst men ever perform. His useful treachery had been rewarded by his employers, as was meet, with money and with contempt. Their liberality enabled him to live during some months like a fine gentleman. He called himself a colonel, hired servants, clothed them in gorgeous liveries, bought fine horses, lodged in Pall Mall, and showed his brazen forehead overtopped by a wig worth 50 guineas in the antechambers of the palace and in the stage box at the theatre. He even gave himself the airs of a favourite of royalty, and, as if he thought that William could not live without him, followed his Majesty first to Ireland and then to the Congress of Princes at the Hague. Fuller afterwards boasted that at the Hague he appeared with a retinue fit for an ambassador, that he gave 10 guineas a week for an apartment, and that the worst waistcoat which he condescended to wear was of silver stuff at 40 shillings a yard. Such profusion, of course, brought him to poverty. Soon after his return to England, he took refuge from the bailiffs in Axe Yard, a place lying within the verge of Whitehall. His fortunes were desperate. He owed great sums. On the government he had no claim. His past services had been overpaid. No future service was to be expected from him. Having appeared in the witness box as evidence for the Crown, he could no longer be of any use as a spy on the Jacobites, and by all men of virtue and honour, to whatever party they might belong, he was abhorred and shunned. Just at this time, when he was in the frame of mind in which men are open to the worst temptations, he fell in with the worst of tempters, in truth with the devil in human shape. Oates had obtained his liberty, his pardon, and a pension which made him a much richer man than 19/20ths of the member of that profession of which he was the disgrace. But he was still unsatisfied. He complained that he had now less than 300 a year. In the golden days of the plot he had been allowed 3 times as much, had been sumptuously lodged in the palace, had dined on plate, and had been clothed in silk. He clamoured for an increase of his stipend. Nay, he was even imprudent enough to aspire to ecclesiastical preferment, and thought it hard that, while so many mitres were distributed, he could not get a deanery, a prebend, or even a living. He missed no opportunity of urging his pretensions. He haunted the public offices and the lobbies of the Houses of Parliament. He might be seen and heard every day, hurrying as fast as his uneven legs would carry him between Charing Cross and Westminster Hall, puffing with haste and self-importance, chattering about what he had done for the good cause, and reviling, in the style of the boatmen on the river, all the statesmen and divines whom he suspected of doing him ill offices at court and keeping him back from a bishopric. When he found that there was no hope for him in the established church, he turned to the Baptists. They, at first, received him very coldly, but he gave such touching accounts of the wonderful work of grace which had been wrought in his soul, and vowed so solemnly before Jehovah and the holy angels to be thenceforth a burning and shining light, that it was difficult for simple and well-meaning people to think him altogether insincere. He mourned, he said, like a turtle. On one Lord's Day he thought he should have died of grief at being shut out from fellowship with the saints. He was at length admitted to communion, but before he had been a year among his new friends, they discovered his true character and solemnly cast him out as a hypocrite. Thenceforth he became the mortal enemy of the leading Baptists, and persecuted them with the same treachery, the same mendacity, the same effrontery, the same black malice, which had many years before wrought the destruction of more celebrated victims. Those who had lately been edified by his account of his blessed experiences stood aghast to hear him crying out that he would be revenged, that revenge was God's own sweet morsel, that the wretches who had excommunicated him should be ruined, that they should be forced to fly their country, that they should be stripped to the last shilling. His designs were at length frustrated by a righteous decree of the Court of Chancery, a decree which would have left a deep stain on the character of an ordinary man, but which makes no perceptible addition to the infamy of Titus Oates. Through all changes, however, he was surrounded by a small knot of hot-headed and foul-mouthed agitators, who, abhorred and despised by every respectable Whig, yet called themselves Whigs, and thought themselves injured because they were not rewarded for scurrility and slander with the best places under the crown. In 1691, Titus, in order to be near the focal point of political intrigue and faction, had taken a house within the precinct of Whitehall. To this house Fuller, who lived hard by, found admission. The evil work which had been begun in him when he was still a child by the memoirs of Dangerfield was now completed by the conversation of Oates. The Salamanca doctor was, as a witness, no longer formidable, but he was impelled, partly by the savage malignity which he felt to all whom he considered his enemies, and partly by a mere monkey-like restlessness and love of mischief, to do through the instrumentality of others what he could no longer do in person. In Fuller he had found the corrupt heart, the ready tongue, and the unabashed front, which are the first qualifications for the office of a false accuser. A friendship, if that word may be so used, sprang up between the pair. Oates opened his house and even his purse to Fuller. The veteran sinner, both directly and through the agency of his dependents, intimated to the novice that nothing made a man so important as the discovering of a plot, and that these were times when a young fellow who would stick at nothing and fear nobody might do wonders. The Revolution, such was the language constantly held by Titus and his parasites, had produced little good. The brisk boys of Shaftesbury had not been recompensed according to their merits. Even the doctor, such was the ingratitude of men, was looked on coldly at the new court. Tory rogues sat at the council board and were admitted to the royal closet. It would be a noble feat to bring their necks to the block. Above all, it would be delightful to see Nottingham's long, solemn face on Tower Hill, for the hatred with which these bad men regarded Nottingham had no bounds, and was probably excited less by his political opinions, in which there was doubtless much to condemn, than by his moral character, in which the closest scrutiny will detect little that is not deserving of approbation. Oates, with the authority which experience and success entitle a preceptor to assume, read his pupil a lecture on the art of bearing false witness. "You ought," he said, with many oaths and curses, "to have made more, much more, out of what you heard and saw at Saint-Germain. Never was there a finer foundation for a plot. But you are a fool, you are a coxcomb. I could beat you. I would not have done so. I used to go to Charles and tell him his own. I called Lauderdale rogue to his face. I made king, ministers, lords, commons afraid of me. But you young men have no spirit." Fuller was greatly edified by these exhortations. It was, however, hinted to him by some of his associates that, if he meant to take up the trade of swearing away lives, he would do well not to show himself so often at coffee-houses in the company of Titus. "The doctor," said one of the gang, "is an excellent person, and has done great things in his time, but many people are prejudiced against him, and if you are really going to discover a plot, the less you are seen with him the better." Fuller accordingly ceased to frequent Oates' house, but still continued to receive his great master's instructions in private. To do Fuller justice, he seems not to have taken up the trade of a false witness till he could no longer support himself by begging or swindling. He lived for a time on the charity of the Queen. He then levied contributions by pretending to be one of the noble family of Sidney. He wheedled Tillotson out of some money, and requited the good Archbishop's kindness by passing himself off as his Grace's favourite nephew. But in the autumn of 1691 all these shifts were exhausted. After lying in several sponging houses, Fuller was at length lodged in the King's Bench prison, and he now thought it time to announce that he had discovered a plot. He addressed himself first to Tillotson and Portland, but both Tillotson and Portland soon perceived that he was lying. What he said was, however, reported to the King, who, as might have been expected, treated the information and the informant with cold contempt. All that remained was to try whether a flame could be raised in the Parliament. Soon after the Houses met, Fuller petitioned the Commons to hear what he had to say, and promised to make wonderful disclosures. He was brought from his prison to the bar of the House, and he there repeated a long romance. James, he said, had delegated the regal authority to 6 commissioners, of whom Halifax was first. More than 50 lords and gentlemen had signed an address to the French King, imploring him to make a great effort for the restoration of the House of Stuart. Fuller declared that he had seen this address, and recounted many of the names appended to it. Some members made severe remarks on the improbability of the story and on the character of the witness. He was, they said, one of the greatest rogues on the face of the earth, and he told such things as could scarcely be credited if he were an angel from heaven. Fuller audaciously pledged himself to bring proofs which would satisfy the most incredulous. He was, he averred, in communication with some agents of James. Those persons were ready to make reparation to their country. Their testimony would be decisive, for they were in possession of documentary evidence which would confound the guilty. They held back only because they saw some of the traitors high in office and near the royal person, and were afraid of incurring the enmity of men so powerful and so wicked. Fuller ended by asking for a sum of money, and by assuring the Commons that he would lay it out to good account. Had his impudent request been granted, he would probably have paid his debts, obtained his liberty, and absconded. But the House very wisely insisted on seeing his witnesses first. He then began to shuffle. The gentlemen were on the Continent, and could not come over without passports. Passports were delivered to him, but he complained that they were insufficient. At length the Commons, fully determined to get at the truth, presented an address requesting the King to send Fuller a blank safe conduct in the largest terms. The safe conduct was sent. 6 weeks passed, and nothing was heard of the witnesses. The friends of the lords and gentlemen who had been accused represented strongly that the House ought not to separate for the summer without coming to some decision on charges so grave. Fuller was ordered to attend. He pleaded sickness, and asserted, not for the first time, that the Jacobites had poisoned him. But all his plans were confounded by the laudable promptitude and vigour with which the Commons acted. A committee was sent to his bedside, with orders to ascertain whether he really had any witnesses, and where those witnesses resided. The members who were deputed for this purpose went to the King's Bench prison, and found him suffering under a disorder, produced in all probability by some emetic which he had swallowed for the purpose of deceiving them. In answer to their questions, he said that two of his witnesses, Delaval and Hayes, were in England, and were lodged at the house of a Roman Catholic apothecary in Holborn. The Commons, as soon as the committee had reported, sent some members to the house which he had indicated. That house and all the neighbouring houses were searched. Delaval and Hayes were not to be found, nor had anybody in the vicinity ever seen such men or heard of them. The House, therefore, on the last day of the session, just before Black Rod knocked at the door, unanimously resolved that William Fuller was a cheat and a false accuser, that he had insulted the government and the Parliament, that he had calumniated honourable men, and that an address should be carried up to the throne, requesting that he might be prosecuted for his villainy. He was consequently tried, convicted, and sentenced to fine, imprisonment, and the pillory. The exposure, more terrible than death to a mind not lost to all sense of shame, he underwent with a hardihood worthy of his two favourite models, Dangerfield and Oates. He had the impudence to persist year after year in affirming that he had fallen a victim to the machinations of the late King, who had spent £6,000 in order to ruin him. Delaval and Hayes, so this fable ran, had been instructed by James in person. They had, in obedience to his orders, induced Fuller to pledge his word for their appearance, and had then absented themselves and left him exposed to the resentment of the House of Commons. The story had the reception which it deserved, and Fuller sank into an obscurity from which he twice or thrice, at long intervals, again emerged for a moment into infamy. On the 24th of February, 1692, about an hour after the Commons had voted Fuller an impostor, they were summoned to the Chamber of the Lords. The King thanked the Houses for their loyalty and liberality, informed them that he must soon set out for the Continent, and commanded them to adjourn themselves. He gave his assent that day to many bills, public and private, but when the title of one bill, which had passed the Lower House without a single division, and the Upper House without a single protest, had been read by the Clerk of the Crown, the Clerk of the Parliaments declared, according to the ancient form, that the King and Queen would consider the matter. Those words had very rarely been pronounced before the accession of William. They have been pronounced only once since his death, but by him the power of putting a veto on laws which had been passed by the Estates of the Realm was used on several important occasions. His detractors truly asserted that he rejected a greater number of important bills than all the kings of the House of Stuart put together, and most absurdly inferred that the sense of the Estates of the Realm was much less respected by him than by his uncles and his grandfather. A judicious student of history will have no difficulty in discovering why William repeatedly exercised a prerogative to which his predecessors very seldom had recourse, and which his successors have suffered to fall into utter desuetude. His predecessors passed laws easily, because they broke laws easily. Charles I gave his assent to the Petition of Right, and immediately violated every clause of that great statute. Charles II gave his assent to an Act which provided that a Parliament should be held at least once in 3 years. But when he died, the country had been near 4 years without a Parliament. The laws which abolished the Court of High Commission, the laws which instituted the sacramental test, were passed without the smallest difficulty, but they did not prevent James II from re-establishing the Court of High Commission and from filling the Privy Council, the public offices, the courts of justice, and the municipal corporations with persons who had never taken the test. Nothing could be more natural than that a king should not think it worth while to withhold his assent from a statute with which he could dispense whenever he thought fit. The situation of William was very different. He could not, like those who had ruled before him, pass an act in the spring and violate it in the summer. He had, by assenting to the Bill of Rights, solemnly renounced the dispensing power, and he was restrained, by prudence as well as conscience and honour, from breaking the compact under which he held his crown. A law might be personally offensive to him, it might appear to him to be pernicious to his people, but as soon as he had passed it, it was, in his eyes, a sacred thing. He had, therefore, a motive which preceding kings had not, for pausing before he passed such a law. They gave their word readily, because they had no scruple about breaking it. He gave his word slowly, because he never failed to keep it. But his situation, though it differed widely from that of the princes of the House of Stuart, was not precisely that of the princes of the House of Brunswick. A prince of the House of Brunswick is guided as to the use of every royal prerogative by the advice of a responsible ministry, and this ministry must be taken from the party which predominates in the two houses, or at least in the lower house. It is hardly possible to conceive circumstances in which a sovereign so situated can refuse to assent to a bill which has been approved by both branches of the legislature. Such a refusal would necessarily imply one of two things: that the sovereign acted in opposition to the advice of the ministry, or that the ministry was at issue on a question of vital importance. With a majority both of the Commons and of the Lords, on either supposition, the country would be in a most critical state, in a state which, if long continued, must end in a revolution. But in the earlier part of the reign of William there was no ministry. The heads of the executive departments had not been appointed exclusively from either party. Some were zealous Whigs, others zealous Tories. The most enlightened statesmen did not hold it to be unconstitutional that the King should exercise his highest prerogatives on the most important occasions without any other guidance than that of his own judgment. His refusal, therefore, to assent to a bill which had passed both houses indicated not, as a similar refusal would now indicate, that the whole machinery of government was in a state of fearful disorder, but merely that there was a difference of opinion between him and the two other branches of the legislature as to the expediency of a particular law. Such a difference of opinion might exist, and as we shall hereafter see, actually did exist at a time when he was not merely on friendly but on most affectionate terms with the estates of the realm. Section 6.